and I was actually laying down, excavating, and I heard a bunch of people behind me, but I didn't realize how many people were there. And I got done excavating one portion of the burial, and I sat up, and there were probably 20 to 25 family members standing around watching.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Resurrectionist Podcast. This week, we are joined by Leah Williams. Leah has a BA and an MA from Georgia Southern University in Anthropology and Social Sciences. She's done an internship at Georgia Bureau of Investigations in the Medical Examiner's Office, assisting with morgue stuff and autopsies and the likes. She's worked as an archaeologist, and she currently works as a mortuary archaeologist at New South Associations, Inc. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. You have a very interesting career path, so I'm super excited to talk to you about it today.
Sure.
So when you first emailed me, you were telling me about what you studied in university and kind of your research focus as well. So I wanted to touch on that a bit before we go into your very interesting career path as well. So you were saying that you researched fragmentary remains from a vault in a cemetery in Savannah. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So I did not complete a thesis for my master's degree. Instead, I did independent studies and internships to get my degree. And my bigger project was Georgia Southern was merging with another local school, and they were cleaning out the history department of this smaller local school and found a box that said Graham Vault. And had bags full of human remains in them. And they brought it to me and said, "Hey, do you want this to be your big project? Figure out who this is." And so I was like, "Oh, cool. I can do that. I have 5 months. Great." So I got this box and basically dumped it out onto a tray, bag by bag. And I tried to identify what I could. So all of the phalanxes and all of the teeth that came out. And I had to also do a deep dive on the history of the vault as well. So the remains from this box came out from the removal in 1980. And when I was looking through the history, it had been opened 2 other times prior to this. So the first time was in 1901 when Asa Bird Gardner from up in Rhode Island was actually looking for Major General Nathaniel Greene's remains. And he was a Revolutionary War hero down in the South. He was actually given a giant rice plantation by the state whenever the war was over for his family. And because vaults and plantation property are one and the same, he also got this vault when he got that plantation. So when he died, he was buried in this vault, even though it's called the Graham Vault. The plantation was originally from a different family. So they were actually loyalists, and they ran whenever the war started. So that's why it has a different name. But he was buried there, Nathaniel Greene. His son was buried there, George Washington Greene, because, of course, Nathaniel and George Washington, the president, were very good friends. So he named his son after him. And he was buried there when he was 18. He drowned swimming in the Savannah River. And then there was also another man named Colonel John Maitland, who was actually from Scotland. He was buried there. And then the records for that vault burned down. They were kept in a church. The church burnt down. So records aren't all that clear, but we know because in 1901 there was a silver name plaque that had Nathaniel's name on it inside the vault. So that's how they identified him. They removed, during the first opening, they removed Nathaniel Green and his son, and they actually buried them underneath a giant statue in a square a couple of miles away in Savannah. And they closed them up. And then it was in 1980 that they opened it again and removed Colonel Maitland to repatriate him back to Scotland. And they identified him because he was missing an arm. He had one of his arms blown off by a cannon.
It's a pretty identifiable marker there.
Yeah, pretty easy to name him. So then they had all these extra bones and fragments that they had no idea who they were. And that's when the box comes into play. It ended up being a long relative, like a long removed relative of the original Graham family who owned the vault, was buried there. He died of old age. I want to say his name was Robert. And he was like 70 something, and he died of natural causes, but he was a really big lawyer at the time. So very prominent in Savannah. And so he was buried there. It was nice to have prominent people buried in your vault. And then, strangely enough, there were also infant remains that I identified in this vault, but there were no records of any infants being buried in this vault at any time. So we're not really sure where that came from. But the cemetery that this vault sits in has a really tragic history. It's one of the first cemeteries in Savannah. It's called Colonial Park Cemetery, and it's beautiful. If anybody ever gets the chance to visit Savannah, that is one place that I highly recommend you go visit. There's like historical tours that take you through it all the time. But the cemetery kind of fell off. It fell into disrepair after a while, and so one of the reasons for that is because when Sherman did his march to the sea through Georgia, and he was burning down cities as he went, his final stop was Savannah. And a lot of the men in his group and his troop would use their bayonets to change dates on headstones. They caused ruckus and completely destroyed the cemetery, crashing up open vaults, using the cemetery as their horse stables. And when they changed the dates on these vaults, they were basically like changing dates to where you would die before you were born, or you would die at like 1,000 years old. And
so like completely nonsensical dates, like you could tell that they were
complete changed. And just knocking stuff over. And so now there's an entire wall. The only original wall of the cemetery is on the back side, and they have inlaid into the bricks all of the displaced markers on that back wall. So you can actually go to the very back and see all of that, and what they have fixed. And you can see the fixed markers in there, all of the pieces that have been cracked, that have been repaired, knocked over and repaired. But it is no longer an active cemetery, so it is strictly a like sight to see in Savannah. So it's really nice.
Yeah, so this is, I think, one of the reasons why I really wanted to chat with you is because, like, I know what archaeology in Ireland is like. I know what osteology in Ireland is like. I know Americans who work in Ireland, but I've never really spoken to someone who actually works in archaeology or osteology or anything like that, like from the States, who's like working in the States currently as well. Cool. So it's really interesting to have you here because obviously like our histories are very different. The laws and regulations around everything we do, I suppose, are probably fairly different as well. So it's really great to have you on.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, to my knowledge, vaults aren't really a big thing here. At least I don't know of anyone that's buried in one. I don't know that I've ever seen one, really. Is it common for them to be opening them up and moving people through the years like this?
No, it is not. So the only reason that they opened the vault originally in 1901 was because Nathaniel Green's death place was known, but his burial place had been lost. So they don't really keep good track of where people are buried, especially that far back in time for us. The 1700s was a time of chaos, and usually burial places would just be passed down by oral tradition. So grandma knows, grandpa knows, great grandpa knows where people are buried. But and there were a lot of fires that happened. A lot of churches would burn down, and that's where a lot of the records would be kept. And so if your records are there and it burns down, then everything's gone. So for that far back, it's really, it can be very hard to actually have records of where people are buried. So his burial place was lost for 100 years. And that's why Asa Bird Gardner from Rhode Island, he was, I don't know if I may get this name wrong, but it was the Society of the Cincinnati. Why it's called Cincinnati when it's not actually in the city of Cincinnati, Ohio, I do not know. I have no clue. But Nathaniel Green was one of their first presidents of the society. And Asa Bird Gardner was the current, at the time, the current president. And so he was like, we have to figure out where he's buried. This is huge. It's been lost for over 100 years. And so that's why it was originally opened in the first place. And then the Revolutionary War is obviously very big thing in our country, to where we gained our independence. So there are multiple monuments throughout Savannah, and Savannah was a really big place for a lot of battles because it's on the river that leads out to the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a really big port. It has a lot of history. It's one of the most historic places that holds up the history relatively well in Georgia. But no, to circle back, no, it is not common for people to reopen vaults. Usually it's only for if we don't know who's there, if we have no records. And typically nowadays, you don't do it at all unless it is 1,000% necessary.
That makes complete sense. You do not want to interfere with dead people.
No.
So you mentioned that instead of doing a thesis for your master's, you did internships and projects like this. So was your work in the morgue, was that a part of this master's process as well?
Yeah, so I did this project my very last semester, so my last 5 to 6 months within my program before I graduated. And another project that I did was there was a local funeral home that was doing some renovations on their parking lot, and they had a shed out back that they wanted to replace because it was falling down. And they started removing things from this shed, and human remains fell out of a box again. People in boxes.
Never open a box ever.
No. And so one of my other projects was figure out who this person was. Thankfully, that individual was much less degraded, much less decomposed, and his remains were in relatively good condition. And it was an older gentleman who just didn't have any family and didn't have any money to buy a burial space. So they kept his remains in this holding area out back. until they could figure out what to do with them. And then I guess they forgot. I don't really know. Not great practice. But yeah, it's just kind of
Someone
stuff
needs
like,
to update their bookkeeping there.
yeah. And so at the end of, doing the analysis for these projects, I would write a report, and it would then go to my professors, and then they would say, yes, this is acceptable. No, it isn't. Thankfully, they didn't tell me that I sucked, and and then I could move on. So, but the bigger project, the Savannah project, I was able to present at a school-wide research symposium, so I could actually disseminate my information, which was really cool.
I always find it very fun to get to talk to people about the things you're
Yeah.
interested in and fangirl over them a bit with other people who are hopefully equally as interested.
Yeah, this was a school-wide symposium, so I don't know how. I tried to keep it as like layman's terms as possible, because people are like, "What's the third premolar? Like, what does that mean? What is a third molar?" It's like, that's your wisdom tooth.
Yeah. It can be difficult when my friends are like, what did you do at work today? And I'm like, well, you're a teacher and you're a nurse, so I don't
Yep.
think you'll understand what I could do.
Yeah. Yep. I'm like, I was in the woods all day. That's all. I don't know what to tell you. I took
I
pictures of
have
trees.
I have a friend who works in CSI who did her master's with me, and even we are not our jobs
Yeah.
do not line up conversation wise.
Yeah.
So while you were working at the medical examiner's office, were you involved in autopsies and stuff like that as
Yeah.
well? Or yes. Okay.
Yeah. So unfortunately, when I started, the person before me, or a couple people before me, was actually the other intern. She was doing an autopsy or helping with one, and she cut herself with a scalpel in the process. And so we weren't actually allowed to cut open the deceased, to actually do the autopsies, but we were there to help clean the stations, move the individuals from intake to the actual autopsy room, and then back out to the outtake area, take photos of them, clean them, remove any medical equipment that they may have had if they came from the hospital. And then making sure that everything is good and tidy for the autopsy technicians who are actually conducting the autopsies and the medical examiners who are coming in. It's keeping everything in line, making sure that they had everything that needed. And I was also there to watch. I could stand over and watch them do the entire thing, which was really cool, and really helpful. There were a couple of things that I never could get used to, and still kind of creep me out to today. But
I can only imagine.
yeah, yeah, that is, and I enjoyed it, but that is where I learned I don't want to do soft tissue. I just, I was like, this was a great experience and I loved it, but I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. I'm good. I think I've gotten my fill.
I don't blame you for that. I don't know that I would be very interested to sit in on an autopsy, but I don't know that I can mess with fleshy things. It ain't for me.
Yep. So I did that at the very end of my undergraduate degree. And one of the requirements was that you had to be a full-time student. Well, where I went to school and where the medical examiner's office is 3 hours away from each other. So I was also working. So I was working on campus, in our resident facilities office. I was taking a full load of courses, and I was driving every single weekend, 3-ish hours, to go do this internship every weekend for 5 months.
That's dedication.
That was one of the busiest times of my life. I had no other time.
Yeah, no, I could not do that.
Yep.
I value my free time far too much.
Yep. I do now. I do now for sure.
So clearly you decided that working with, skeletonized remains was more your forte to working with very recently dead
Yes.
remains. Um, and so did you know then that you wanted to work as like an osteologist or, with skeletonized remains then, or is it always something you wanted to do, or is it kind of something you realized like as you're going through college?
So I was originally planning on going into forensics. And this is so cliche. I don't know if you've ever heard of the show Bones.
Yes.
Okay.
Obviously.
When I was in high school, I watched that show and I was so intrigued. And I was like, that puts everything that I love learning. And I was so stubborn in high school. I was like, I'm not giving up what I love to learn. And I told my counselor in high school, who kind of helped us figure out what kind of colleges we wanted to go to. I was like, hey, I don't want to lose anything. I want to learn history. I want to study anatomy, and I want to study cultures all at the same time. And I really don't care about math, so cut that out. And I was like, I'm going to find a program that fits all of those three things. And so when I saw the show Bones, I was like, oh, that's actually an option. And so I went into it and then researched it further and fell even more in love with the profession of forensic anthropology. And so that's what my original goal was. And when I graduated with my undergraduate degree, it was a really bad time in hiring in America. Like nobody was hiring anywhere. And so I was like, well, I can't afford to pay rent without a job. And I refuse to work in something that I don't have a degree in. So I guess I'm going back to school. And so I went straight back into graduate school that following fall. And then that is when I actually switched to archaeology. So I was using all of the stuff that I had learned in my anatomy courses, in my forensics courses, and applying that to archaeology, and I just kind of switched over. Thankfully, it worked really well because it's still in the same realm, and I can still use those same practices that you would use in forensics when you're looking at skeletonized remains to look at archaeological remains. So it helped that they weren't too far removed, but I did have to switch my goals there a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. I always sort of think of like forensic anthropology is very interesting to me. I also love bones and was heavily influenced by it. But at least here, there's no jobs in forensic anthropology, really. It is all like archaeology jobs.
Yeah, when I was doing my internship at the medical examiner's office, the person who actually does the skeletonized remains analysis, she's actually a professor at a local college, at a local university. And so she's actually not even full-time employed with the Georgia Bureau of Investigations. She is a consultant. And so when I found that out, I was like, oh, I can't just do like medical examiner. Like I can't be employed by the medical examiner because there's just not enough cases that come in that way. So when I learned that, I was like, oh, so I'm gonna have to seriously look into switching if I ever want to do this full time. So it was kind of sad at the moment, but I love what I do now and wouldn't change it. So
Well, it's great that you've like found a field that you do love, it is still like related. It's not completely different. It's just a slight like time period shift.
Yeah, and I've been able to help out on a couple forensics cases here and there. So it's not all lost.
So, yes, you've worked as an archaeologist as well when you finished college. So, kind of how does archaeology work in America is my question, but that's probably a bad question to ask if you haven't worked outside of America.
No. So we have some federal regulations that, not to get political, are potentially in the process of not existing anymore because of our current climate. But for now, we do have federal regulations in place that anytime construction is to happen on a piece of undeveloped land, an archaeologist must go in to ensure that there are no cultural materials present. So we have 3 phases of archaeology: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1 is your shovel testing. That is kind of like, okay, we're going to go in and we're going to basically make this piece of land Swiss cheese, and we are going to put holes in it at typically 30-meter intervals. And each state has different requirements on what those holes are supposed to look like. So some states are saying, okay, you can do a 50-centimeter round hole. Some say it's a 30-centimeter round hole. Some say you have to dig a square hole. It just depends on, and digging a square hole with a spade shovel can be quite a challenge. It can be done. It does take practice. So, and then if we find something, we have the National Register of Historic Places that kind of gives us a checklist of, okay, do the materials that you have collected, do they have integrity? Are your soils intact? Meaning, are they disturbed? Are they the same as what they've always been? And then we can say, yes, it's eligible for the register. And in that case, we can say it needs further study. So then we move on to a phase 2. And then that's when we start putting in test units in specific areas and collecting just in certain areas where we foresee there being more artifacts that could lead us to further conclusions about the site. And then a phase 3 is kind of a complete wide swath of collections. So we still do the test units, but it's more inclusive of the entire site instead of just small sections. In my case, with cemeteries and with mortuary work, there are no federal regulations. So it's all up to the states, which is really interesting because every state is different and they require different things, and some care more than others about their cemeteries. But generally, we go in after the phase 1 if there is a cemetery or if there are burials that have been located by the phase 1 team that they didn't know were there. And then that's when I come in, or me and my team, or somebody else like me, and we say, okay, based on the surface indicators that we're seeing, we're looking at vegetation differences, we're looking at, is there anything on the surface, and to determine that there are potential burials here. Then we go into, okay, this is how many there are. This is how big the cemetery is. This is where you have to stay out of. And most of the time, the construction companies will avoid the area. And a lot of times it's our Department of Transportation's within our state we do a lot of work for. Anytime a road is changed, anytime a bridge is replaced, we have to go in and do phase 1 surveys. So thankfully, our phase 1 teams are really good at being like, hey, this doesn't belong out here. This is weird. And then they let us know and say, hey, you should come check this out. Even if it's not anything, I'd rather them say, hey, this doesn't look right, and then call us in anyways. But for the most part, my job is keeping construction out of the area. In some cases, a resolution cannot be come to, and we do have to move the cemetery. And in that case, that requires a whole slew of city council meetings and permitting and getting the family, if we can identify who the family is, like the descendant family of the people who are buried within a certain cemetery, we have to get them involved. If they say no, then our hands are tied. We can't really do anything. And then when it comes to our native and indigenous tribes, that's a whole nother thing that we have to go through consultations with all of the different tribes that may be in the area. So, and it can get very messy because we don't have federal regulations, and it is kind of up to the presiding groups, so the state or the tribes or the families. But that's kind of the fun part of it too, at least I think, getting to talk with
No,
different people.
Yeah, no, it sounds very interesting. It's not too dissimilar actually to how we do things here. Usually we go in ahead of construction, and generally we excavate the whole thing, just because if someone's decided that they're going to build there, they're usually pretty set on building there. And
Yeah.
our country is not as big, so, the
Yeah,
little plot
thankfully,
of land you have is
right.
kind of all you've
Thankfully,
got.
majority of the time, it's Department of Transportation work. At least in my company, that's what we do a lot of. Is a lot of Department of Transportation work. So most of the time, areas have been surveyed before, but they're kind of like resurveying it just to cover their own butts, just to triple check that there's nothing there.
Yeah, it's similar with our road projects here as well, where those are the ones where if we hit a cemetery or something, you're more likely to be able to shift a road a little bit
Yeah.
than a building or something, let's say. So, yeah, you were talking about, how you interact with like living descendants, or particularly like indigenous individuals when it comes to these cemeteries. So, and you talk about like, if you find a cemetery, let's say, how do you even go about finding who the living descendants of these individuals might be?
So the really easy part would be if all of the burials had inscriptions on the grave markers. Then we can use my company has historians also employed with us. So we can turn to them, and they have different resources that they can look at, census records. We can search in genealogy records that we can actually look at to be like, okay, we have this person. Here's when they were born. Here's when they died. Here's where they are buried. And from that, we can at least trace it a little bit. If the records are really great, we can take it all the way down to now. And then we start looking at, okay, local obituaries to find out who is surviving the most recent deceased person from this line. Then we can find out, strangely, where they live, what their phone number is, and we can reach out to them. We can send letters to say, hey, there's a potential risk for a family cemetery that we have traced to you and your family. So if you have any qualms about us moving the cemetery or any kind of construction around your family cemetery, please let us know. If we don't have markers, then we start looking at who owned the land. So we're looking at deed records. So I'm actually physically going to the courthouse, looking at the physical deeds seeing if I can trace it back, if there's even a mention of the cemetery on the deed. Sometimes there's not. Majority of the time, there is not. Now, I know in the state of Georgia, where I live, you can actually deed a specific area of your property as a cemetery as and it be tax exempt, so you don't have to pay land taxes on it. So a lot of people, it's weird to me, um, will actually have their family members buried on their property instead of an established cemetery in order to do that, in order to get that tax exempt status on that part of their land. They can't do it for their whole property, but they can for that small section. Um, but sometimes, a lot of times, there's no records of cemeteries, especially where I'm from, down way south in Georgia. It's very rural, rural. And we come across um, burials kind of all the time, and they're not marked. Or if they were marked, it's marked with a stone. Or if it was marked sometime in the past, it was, a wooden cross or something that's no longer there. So we do the best that we can. And in the case that we can't find a specific family or a specific person to reach out to, in the state of Georgia, we are required to put out a notice in the local newspapers in the area, as well as like online newspapers, to say, hey, if you believe that you have a family member buried in this area in an unmarked grave, there's a construction project that's getting ready to happen. Please let us know if we don't hear anything. And we have to do it once a week for 4 consecutive weeks.
Wow.
So we have to wait until then, because then that's our due diligence of letting, we can say, we tried. We at least tried. And if nobody comments, if nobody says anything, and reaches out to us, then we continue on as planned. If not, and they do reach out to us, then we backpedal and try to figure out a resolution.
It sounds like a lot of like detective work, like actual
Yeah.
like going to courthouses, looking up old files. Like it sounds like
Yeah.
a cold case kind of thing.
Yeah, it can be, especially with a lot of places, they don't have online records. So they'll have online records up to a certain year. So like the 1920s is typically when they stop putting records online. And we know that there are records past then, but you have to go in person to actually look at the papers past certain years. So you can try to look it up online as much as you can. Sometimes you hit a dead end there and end up having to go in person, which is fine. It's like a little field trip. I don't mind it.
Break from the office.
Yeah.
So do you find that people do take issue with you having to move the cemeteries very often? Is it something that when you do find family members, is it usual or unusual for them to say, no, we don't want you to be moving anyone?
So when I first started with the company that I work with now, we were getting ready to do a cemetery relocation, and it sounds so bad. But there was one person in the family who did not want this to happen. Everyone else was fine with it. Because when you tell them, hey, we're going to be moving this cemetery, you have to present how long it's going to take, what your methods are, where you're going to be moving them, and that you have approval from the relocation site that they're going to accept these remains and rebury them at a specific area. So when you go to these families, you're like, hey, we have a plan. It's not just, hey, we want to move your great grandma. we have this plan of what we're actually going to be doing. But this one lady, she was an elderly woman. She did not want this cemetery to be moved. It was maybe 12 people. It was 12 or 13 individuals that we were going to be moving. Very small family cemetery. And we had to wait until she passed away. It took about 2 to 3 years. And then once she was the voice of no, was no longer voicing her opinion, everyone else was okay with it, and we were able to move forward. So there are cases like that. There's another case that I did, gosh, was it last year? I think it was beginning of last year. The family was totally fine with it. They were like, yeah, sure. We kind of want to be involved. And they were moving the cemetery because they needed it to put a school, an elementary school, on the land. And funnily enough, the descendants lived right across the street. And so they were totally fine. They were like, hey, we just kind of want to be involved. And so they were there every single day that we were out there doing the excavations. They came and checked up on us, brought us water. They were so sweet. This was in South Carolina, just one state up from us. They were so nice, and they were totally fine with it. I think they may have been more okay with it because they were there, because they could check on us to make sure we were doing things right. But they were so sweet. And in Southern America fashion, it was a married couple, and they had followed their families back, and they were like fifth cousins twice removed, and they knew that when they got married. So they were like, it's technically both of our families because we're related. but
distantly, very distantly. It's fine.
Yeah, a long time ago.
Yeah, that's very interesting, like thinking about like having people around who are like involved in what you're doing and like related to it.
Yeah, that one family, they had lived in that area for hundreds of years, like since they were given land grants from the king, like before like the states were established. They had been living in this area. So they had an established, and like everyone knew everybody, and everyone was related in some shape. Like everyone was a cousin or an aunt or an uncle by marriage or by blood. So I think on our last day out there, we had one person within this cemetery who had a marker with their name on it, and it was just one of them. And we ended up having 16 people, 16 individuals that we relocated from the cemetery, but only one person had a marker with their name on it. And the family had requested that we leave that person for the last to be excavated, because they all wanted to be there to pay their respects. And I was actually laying down, excavating, and I heard a bunch of people behind me, but I didn't realize how many people were there. And I got done excavating one portion of the burial, and I sat up, and there were probably 20 to 25 family members standing around watching. I was quite taken aback. I was like, oh, hello, everyone. How are you? But they were all super nice and super sweet. They actually took us out to eat for lunch that day. So that was very nice of them.
I get nervous enough when my supervisor is standing over my shoulder. I couldn't imagine having like the great grandkids or whatever of the person I'm digging up being like, what you doing? How's it going?
Yeah, they would come out twice a day, every single day, and we were there for 3 weeks. Yeah.
It's dedication. They were clearly very invested in what was going on as well.
Yes, they were. And they were super, they had like really good questions. Like we were pulling up artifacts, and one person actually had a really beautiful black glass brooch in their burial. They were buried with a brooch, a little mourning brooch. It was a heart shape. It had grape leaves on it. It was beautiful. But they were asking, like, what's the history of this? Why did they have this buried with them? And so that was really fun to kind of have them there to see that, but also to tell them, like, hey, this actually has a history. Like, this is actually important. And we can actually tell a lot about your family from this one thing. So that was really cool.
I think it's so interesting to think about because we don't do anything like this in Ireland at all, or I don't think in the UK really either. The only case I can think of is like last year, the family of a man who was executed like decades ago and later found innocent wanted his body back naturally
Oh,
to be buried in a proper cemetery, not in the prison graveyard. So like that's the only case I can think of. Normally we like leave the recently dead untouched, or like we don't, like we're looking at like prehistoric burials, medieval, like at the
yeah.
latest. We tend not to go try not to go any more modern than that. So it's so interesting to think about. But I do think that it is something we may have to think about more in Ireland, especially with cases like this wrongly executed man, or just as the country grows, the need possibly to move more modern cemeteries may arise as well. So it's very interesting to hear about your work.
Yeah, typically ours is kind of reversed. Like if it's a historic burial, from the creation of our country to now, as long as it's a as long as it's a white person, there's a lot less pushback from the communities. Like African American communities, indigenous communities, Hispanic communities, Asian communities, they have their culture is different than ours in a sense. So their historic culture is different. So they want to keep where their people are buried. That's where they are meant to be buried. You do not mess with them unless you absolutely have to. Meanwhile, if it's, a historic white family who probably were slave owners in the South, it's kind of like, meh, you can kind of do what you want as long as the family's okay with it. I did have a case in Virginia that it was probably a 10-hour drive for me to get there. An entire neighborhood was buried on top of an African American section of a cemetery in the 1800s. So it was a giant cemetery near Washington, D.C. And back when this neighborhood was being developed, they placed a park across the street. They had removed the white section. And they, quote unquote, moved the African American section. They did not. They moved the headstones of the African American section and left them where they were. And now people in this neighborhood are wanting to renovate their homes because they're a little older. They need a little bit more space. They're all townhomes. And because it's in a historic district, they can't go up. They can't renovate up because it would deface the property. But they can build basements. So they're going in and starting to excavate their crawl spaces and basements and are running into burials. And so we had 3 homes on one street that we were working on. One of them ended up having, I want to say it was 56 individuals underneath their home and in their backyard. And then the second house that I worked on personally, we removed 17 individuals, probably associated with the African American section of the cemetery. So, and that happens a lot, unfortunately, especially in like the 1960s, 1950s, when you see a report that says a cemetery was moved, you have to take it with a grain of salt because it probably wasn't. And it wasn't done correctly, or they didn't get everything and everyone. So that's always fun when we're called in for kind of a salvage project. Just do what we can.
So you, in this case, let's say hypothetically, you've gone in somewhere, you've found that there's a cemetery there, you've contacted the living relatives, they say, yeah, no, it's fine, move them if you have to. What does that actual moving of the cemetery look like?
So we go in with heavy equipment. Well, first we do a full survey of what we see on the surface. And we create a map of our surface features. So how many burials do we see? Are there any headstones? And then that goes into what are the headstones made out of? How are they oriented? Are they north-south orientation? Are they east-west? And then we take photos of everything. Are there inscriptions on the markers? And then we go in, remove the markers, and when we take the map later, we can superimpose our surface map to what we find subsurface on top of each other to see what matches, so that whenever we move them, we can actually match up the headstones to the right people when they get moved to their other cemetery. Once we remove those markers, we then use heavy equipment to strip the topsoil off of the surface. And then myself or someone on my team will identify the differences in the soil that will actually mark the grave shaft. And then we rope those off, essentially. We put little nails in each corner and string to demarcate, okay, here's one feature, here's feature 2, here's feature 3. Because at that point, we don't know. We have no idea who the person is because we've moved their markers, right? So then we go in by hand once we note what the feature is and where it is. And then we go in by hand and dig out the grave shaft until we get to the remains. And of course, we are sifting all of this soil as we go, just in case there's any like receptacle debris that's left. So any nails, any wood, any kind of like decoration that may have been on it, any glass, if the coffin or casket had like glass viewing panes or anything like that. Then we get to the remains, and then typically they will let just me, because I have more experience in the actual removal of the remains, to come out. And then I'll do that personally, and then we transfer that to bags, and that we let them dry out, because a lot of times our soil is very wet, and the more wet it is, the more apt the bones are to fall apart. So we then move them to a bag, let them dry out over a couple of days in an office nearby. And then once those are dried out and we can actually handle them, but that's when I come back in to the office and I start analyzing the remains to say, okay, can I create a biological profile of this individual to ensure that it matches with the headstone that it's supposed to match up to? And then once that is done, the construction company has already come through once we're done excavating and all of the remains are out. We're done with that area, essentially. Then once I'm done analyzing, we'll rebury them in. We've actually made like reburial boxes, and we keep some of the soil from the very bottom to rebury with that person, just in case there's like any bone meal left in the soil. We keep that and rebury that with the individual as well. So then we'll build these boxes, put them in as anatomical order as possible. And then once we get to the relocation site, usually the markers are already up and ready. And then we just place them into the ground and then we bury them.
Wow. It's a very interesting process going through and
Mhm.
like knowing as you're digging potentially like who these people are or were and you know who they're related to especially. But
Mhm.
yeah, no, it's a very interesting process. Do you find like you're saying that you find items and stuff sometimes in the graves as well, people being buried with brooches, I'm sure, you know,
Mhm.
loads of different objects. What is the most maybe impactful or interesting thing you think you've found in with someone?
Um, the cemeteries that I typically work in are more of like the poorer areas. Um, so they didn't have a lot buried with them because they had so like shoes, got to use them for the next family member. So a lot of times shoes are not found. Um, what have I found? I found the brooch. We've had dentures. Um, we've had some necklaces. We've had hairpins and hair combs. Like we had one individual had a hair comb on either side, which was really cute to think about. She had her hair pulled back. I'm sure she was. I bet that person, we ended up finding out she had a lot of decoration on her casket. Um, and the way that it had degraded actually was because it was completely chrome. And so she would have been blinging out. Like she would have been shiny on her casket. But
Pimp my casket style.
she had a viewing pane on her casket. It was an oval and she had all of the hardware, all of the thumb screws and the escutcheons, and her nameplate were chrome. Her handles were chrome, which is wild. Um, but I think, yeah, that the chromed out coffin hardware would have probably been like, the most interesting to me because it was a poorer family cemetery. I was like, this sticks out quite a bit.
Definitely. So there's many interesting aspects of your job. It might be a terribly mean question to ask, but was there any particular part of what you do that is your favorite thing to do or favorite aspect of your work?
Apart from the cemetery relocations, because we don't get to do them very often, I really enjoy doing ancestry work. So I like following the clues of, okay, I have one person that I have a name for. What can I find? Who can I find that this person is related to? Can I even determine that they have any living descendants? Um, this one family that we did in South Carolina, the one that came out to see us all the time, they had a huge family that I did all of the genealogy research for. Um, and I think one point they had one couple in that family had 17 children. And so I had to follow each 17 kids. It took a very long time, but it was also very interesting because we have, of course, ancestry.com is kind of our go-to place because it has all of the census records in it as well. Um, they have photos of these people. So I can look at them and be like, "Oh, this is what you look like." And then maybe there's some family resemblance later on down the line. And I enjoy doing that a lot. So I always volunteer. I'm like, no, don't give it off to the historians. I can do it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like, I know my cousins sort of on and off done our family tree, over the years. It's a lot of work, especially when you've got huge families and you have to track down every single line.
Yeah.
And you saying you find photos of people as well. Like, I can't imagine what it's like to stare at a skull and have a photo and like know that like that's
Mm-hmm.
that person.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially when like the one one of the people that we had in that cemetery was a Civil War veteran, and they had died during the war. And so there were pictures of this person in their military uniform. And so it's so cool. Like you can actually see this is who this is.
Yeah, I would presume as well that they would have been possibly buried in that uniform as well. So that's like exactly probably what they would have looked like in their casket too.
Sometimes, I know a lot of times back then, though, they would have to reuse uniforms. So, many times you just kind of get buried in what you had, um, or in a shroud. So just
Oh,
wrapped up in
okay.
fabric.
That's interesting to note. Yeah, I suppose you're saying you work with, usually individuals who are in poorer cemeteries, so it would make
Okay.
sense that something like a uniform would get reused.
Okay.
So you mentioned as well that sometimes you do work on behalf of museums and things as well. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so it's usually only if they don't have an osteologist on staff, um, or if they don't have like a university nearby who they can reach out to help. Um, we had a case come in or a project come in from a museum up in North Carolina. So I work in like the southeast section of the United States. So anywhere from like Texas to the Atlantic coast, and then up into Virginia. So it's kind of like a wide swath. Um, so this cemetery or this museum in North Carolina had a collection from an amateur archaeologist who did not keep records of where he found these things. Um, and he had multiple individuals that he had excavated somewhere. Um, and they were like, well, we believe that these people are indigenous, but we really don't know. Um, can you determine if these people were indigenous or if they were not based on what we have? And can you match any of the bones together to create an individual because they were all separate and they weren't labeled? Um, so we had, like 3 skulls in a bag. And you're like, okay, well, which femur goes to which skull, you know? So we did have that situation come up recently. But typically it'll go to a nearby university that has students that can do it because unfortunately, when it comes to my work, it can be a little bit more expensive because I am so specialized. And a lot of times people don't have the funds to do that. So they can take it to universities, usually for cheaper or for free, to have the students look at them.
That makes sense. Here, do a little manual labor for us. We'll
Yeah.
call it education.
Yep.
So I wonder, is there any advice or tips or tricks you can give to anyone in America who's interested in going into anthropology or forensics, osteology, archaeology, sort of your area of expertise? Is there any advice you can give?
I was very stubborn when I was going through school. I did not take any breaks at all. So I went straight through. So I finished my undergraduate degree, which usually takes 4 years here. It took me 2.5. Because I went straight through all of my semesters. I went through straight through my summers. Um, I graduated from high school in 2016 and graduated with my undergraduate degree in May of 2019. So I went straight through. I took no breaks. And then, of course, I went straight into graduate school right after that. And that took me 2 years, which usually takes people around 4 again, but that's also because I did not do a thesis. So usually if you do a thesis, it takes a little longer. But yeah, take your breaks, please. Do not burn out. Be stubborn, but also take care of yourself. Um, take every opportunity that comes to you. If you think it can help you, it probably can. So even if it seems a little weird, like doing a medical examiner's internship when you want to do archaeology, when I got hired with the company that I work for now, they told me that one of the reasons that I was a runner, like a top runner, was because of my medical examiner's internship. Because I had that something different. So don't be scared to do something different because it may help you in the long run. If you think it's kind of adjacent, go for it. If you think you'll enjoy it, go for it. Why not?
I think that's really great advice, especially when so many people just do the college route straight through, and then you've got hundreds of people with essentially the same degree applying for the same job. Having those little extra things can really add a lot.
Yeah, because that experience helped me a few years ago. We had a missing persons case come through in our state. It was a missing 20-month-old. And they reached out to my university and said, "Hey, do you have anybody who with this specialty who can help us?" And they said, "Well, we have a professor, but she's busy doing classes. Um, we have a recent graduate who may actually can help." And so they reached out to me. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, reached out to me to come down and help on this missing persons case. Unfortunately, I was not there when they found him. But they did find the little boy. Unfortunately, he was found in a landfill. So that was why they called me in, because they knew that the mother had essentially wrapped him up in a trash bag and thrown him away. And so they were having to go through the landfill and sort through, the chicken bones that came from the restaurant down the street versus a 20-month-old, which when you're looking at 20-month-old long bones and chicken wings, they look really similar. And so that was part of my training while I was in the medical examiner's office, was looking through stuff like that as well. So I had that, and I was able to go in and help out. So it seems odd, but it does help out in the future. Promise.
And if nothing else, it's an interesting story to have.
Yep.
Yeah, I used to work in a medical examiner's office.
Yep.
So you mentioned as well before how there's no federal laws around like excavating cemeteries, or like what happens when you hit
Mhm.
like a historical cemetery in archaeology. So do you feel like there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in like legislation or like the future of archaeological works in America?
Well, I think if we can keep what we've got, um,
That's probably a good
going
place
right
to
now.
start. Let's not go backwards.
Yeah, we're really trying really hard in our community to not go backwards with the current climate that we're in. So we're just trying to keep archaeology intact as a whole right now. If it were now, when it comes to cemeteries, because we're so big, because our country is so big, every region has their own burial practices, and so every cemetery looks different. Even archaeology throughout the country looks different. Like in the Midwest, so in places like Colorado and Wyoming, you don't have to dig holes during your phase ones. All you really have to do is pedestrian survey because everything is on the surface. Nothing is buried. So when it comes to cemeteries, it's kind of the same way. You've got people who are, buried 3 feet in one area. You've got people who I've come across 7 feet in another area. You've got cemeteries like along the coast, like in Louisiana specifically has a really good example of this. Like in New Orleans, they have all of their burials above ground because of the water table is so high. So I like that everything is kind of state regulated in some sense, but I do feel like a wider, hey, if you come across a cemetery, don't touch it, kind of guideline.
Yeah, just a very basic, like, do not move the dead people. Or like,
Yeah.
only if strictly necessary, move the dead people.
Or if there was some kind of repercussion for vandalizing a cemetery on your own property. So essentially, especially in the South, if it's on your property, it's yours. You can do whatever the heck you want with it. Which can be detrimental. We had a problem a few months ago where we were doing a phase one and a homeowner was alongside the side of a road, and the homeowner comes out and was like, oh yeah, a couple, like 8 years ago, we were bush hogging this wooded area and taking all the trees down, and my husband was running the tractor, and we found a headstone kind of pushed up into the trash pile that they didn't know about. And they didn't report it to anybody. And they didn't let anybody know. And then it come to find out a couple years ago, they took all of that trash pile off to the dump. So we don't even have the headstone anymore. We have no idea where this individual was buried. We had no idea where they came from, where they are currently. And we're probably not going to because it's on this person's personal property. And if they want to find out what's there, they have to pay for it. They have to pay for the GPR study. They have to pay for the archaeological study in order for us to find that individual, which will probably never happen. But they face no repercussions for damaging that headstone or removing that headstone. So it's kind of like, yes, it's good because it varies so much, but also there's no blanket statement to say, hey, don't do that.
Yeah, I feel like as a baseline, like countrywide, there should maybe be a rule of like, do not damage the cultural heritage, even if it's technically yours. Please don't damage it.
Yeah, and it's like people who live on properties that have, creeks or rivers that run through it. They technically can go walk the banks of that river and pull up native artifacts out of the riverbeds and keep them and sell them. And like just do whatever they want with it. They don't have to record where it came from. They don't have to take photos of it. They can literally go out to the banks of the river or the creek, pull up these Native American artifacts and sell them for personal gain because it's on their property.
I'd never really thought about that, but it makes sense. People would have so much more land in certain
Mm-hmm.
parts of America, and that like you would have natural features going through. You would have historical cemeteries in the middle of them, and like they wouldn't be recorded and they wouldn't be protected. They would just
Yep.
belong to the people. But I hadn't really thought about it ever. It's a
Mm-hmm.
very like fascinating to me. Like, yeah, no, the heritage and history of your culture, your entire country belongs to you personally, and you can do whatever you want to it.
Yeah. A lot of people, at least that I've come across, and frankly, even people in my own family, are kind of like, well, it was in the past. It doesn't concern me. Why do I need to care? So, and that is a sentiment that is carried around by a lot of people. A lot of people. And it can be very frustrating when you're trying to explain, like, this is why I do what I do. There's a reason for all of this. Don't you want to protect your history? And they're like, doesn't bother me. Doesn't concern me. Doesn't really matter. So when you have that attitude, it's kind of easy to just not care about what's on your property.
Yeah, I've definitely encountered people over the years that are like, but why do you have to go
Mm-hmm.
in and delay building for 6 months to excavate this thing? And I'm like, because it's our history and it's important. But why? It's our
Yep.
history. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
anymore. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah. Because you can learn so much that you don't know.
Yeah, and I feel like even sometimes the archaeology we do, we don't end up putting enough research into, like, obviously we categorize everything, like we save everything, we protect everything, it goes to the museum, but there's so much more detailed research that could go into some of the things that we find that
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't, and you're just hoping that someone realizes there's a collection of that stuff in a museum storehouse somewhere and someday
Yeah.
does a PhD on it or something.
Yeah. A lot of times when we tell people, they're like, well, what are you going to do with all of this stuff once you find it? It's like, well, we take photos of it and we curate it and we, you know, look at the history, say, hey, maybe assign a date range of this artifact to say, hey, it's possible that people were in this area 1,000 to 2,000 years ago doing this activity. And that's really cool. That's really awesome that we can do that. They don't care. And then, and then we'll say, okay, well, what after that? And it's like, well, it gets curated and it goes into a box and it kind of just gets stuck in a repository somewhere, hoping that somebody finds it interesting enough to study. And they're like, so just throw it away. I'm like, I can't. That's not, no, we're not going to throw it away. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah. It is a frustrating aspect of the job that, I hope that this podcast, documentaries, more archaeologists getting out there and talking about the history, like, gets people more interested and involved.
Hmm.
But there are certain people that you're like, it doesn't matter what I say, you're never going
Yeah.
to change your mind. It's talking to a brick wall.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I try my best, and especially right now, my fiance is actually an archaeologist as well, and he does a lot of public outreach stuff with kids. So he'll visit schools and like be like, "Hey, this is what archaeology is, and you can do it too, and it's really fun and it's really cool." And so we're trying to. It's kind of dying here. I won't say dying. It's not as a popular. Like people are like, "Oh, well, I'm going to go to engineering school. I'm going to be an engineer and make all the money." And so the social sciences are kind of falling behind when engineering and math, the STEM, it's super important. Yes, science, technology, engineering, math, super important. But archaeology is a science and it should be included in STEM programs, but it's not. So we're trying to kind of be like, hey, this is a thing. It's real. It's important. It's just as important as engineering and biology and technology and IT and all of this other stuff. It's just as important as all of that too.
And it arguably plays into a lot of that as well. Like, our
Oh,
history
100%.
is the history of engineering and is the history of biology and science and like our own genetics and stuff. Like, if we understand the past, we can use those, information in like
Mhm.
STEM fields and things as well. It's not its
Yeah.
own little bubble that has no bearing on life now.
Yeah. One of the programs that he was telling me about was these kids are using STEM, so using robotics as art in archaeology. So, like, how can we make robots that help archaeology? What can we make with engineering to help? Which I think is super cool. And it's kids. It's like third grade or fifth grade. So, like, what is that? Fifth grade? Seventh grade is 12. So fifth grade would be 10-year-olds. Getting 10 and 11-year-olds really interested in archaeology is great and needs to happen more across the
Yeah,
board.
definitely. I worked in a kids camp once, and I also found that kids had like the strangest but most like insightful like thoughts about things. Like, you teach them about a topic, and then some of the questions they'd come out with, you'd be like, hang on, I didn't even think of that. I think there's a research project in
Mhm.
your question there, sir.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my coworkers is doing the same thing. And it's like, hey, can we create a robot that helps us wet screen and sift? And then one of the
That
students
would be
brought that up,
helpful.
and we were like, huh, that would be really cool.
That would be so helpful because sifting is like one of my least favorite activities.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I could probably keep you here all day talking about this, but I think we both have. Well, at least you probably have better things to do at your time. I do not. Um, but I just wanted to ask: is there anything else you feel like we haven't touched on that you want people to know about you, about your work, about archaeology in general?
Um, I would say for people who are interested in mortuary archaeology, funerary archaeology, bioarchaeology in general, um, I would argue that you can find out just as much, if not more, about a society from how they treat their deceased individuals as you can from their artifacts. Um, which I think is one of the big things that brought me in to mortuary work. Um, you don't have to look at what they made or what they did in their daily life to find out information. You can also look at how they treated their deceased population, the care that they took, the money that they put into them to keep them remembered, is just as important as what they made.
Yeah, I think that's really well said because I mean, I'm also a bioarchaeologist, so I'm always just like, no, but the dead people can tell you so much more than just
So
like
much
that they're dead
more.
people.
Because not only can you learn about the person individually, how old were they? Were they a male or a female? What were they wearing? You know, how tall were they? Were they sick? Did they get hurt? Can we see that in their bones? But also, what were they buried in? Who picked that out? You know, what does their marker look like? What do the markers beside them look like? Because that puts it puts it into perspective like, oh, this person could have been really important to these people. Like this wasn't just grandma. This was a pillar of the community. I actually had one case that came in a couple years ago. It was a plantation cemetery, and the largest obelisk in the cemetery had a custom poem written on it. It was beautiful. It was along one of the major rivers in Georgia, and I did some history on them, and it was a couple. It was an elderly couple who actually ran a ferry that went from one side of the river to another, and they were murdered. They were murdered in their bed, and it was never solved. And so this poem and the largest obelisk in the cemetery paid homage to the pillars of community that they were. They weren't just a little sweet old couple who lived there. They were important, and what they left behind shows that. So,
wow, that's a real life true crime case there.
yeah. They ended up trying to charge a local black man with the crime. It was in 1786, 1782, something like that. And it was never solved, and it has gone unsolved this whole time.
Wow. I feel like we probably maybe won't get answers now.
No, probably not. I personally think it was the sun. If you read up on it, I think it was the sun.
I feel like we need to now find a true crime podcast to be like, here, take this case. Find the answers.
Like, hey, I have some news that nobody knows about.
Well, this has all been very fascinating, Leah. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and for telling us all about your work and very interesting cases that you've been on.
Oh, thanks for having me. It was so much fun.
Oh, it's great. And thank you, everybody, for listening. I will see you all next week. Bye, guys.